Aisha Coleman was just another face in the crowd, or so everyone thought. One sweltering afternoon in the heart of Chicago, she found herself in a confrontation with a local cop that would change both of their lives forever. The whispers spread quickly, a black woman standing up against a law enforcement officer in a high-stakes court battle. That alone was sensational. But beneath the surface, an even bigger secret lay coiled, ready to strike. Aisha's credentials weren't just impressive, they were elite. And as she stepped into the harsh glare of the public eye, no one was prepared for the shockwaves that would follow. A legacy of strength. Aisha's early life had never been easy, but she learned to face adversity head-on, a trait instilled in her by her parents. Her father, Samuel Coleman, was a school teacher who had grown up near Montgomery, Alabama. He used to tell her stories of the historic Montgomery bus boycott, explaining how black men and women stood their ground for the right to be treated as equals. Her mother, Lorraine Coleman, served as a nurse in the very hospital where Aisha was born in Chicago. They believed in the power of education and perseverance. They urged her to aim high, so high that the glass ceiling they had faced would shatter into a million pieces. Aisha grew up just a few miles from the DuSable Museum of African American History. As a child, she wandered through the exhibits, enthralled by the stories of civil rights legends who had literally changed the law of the land. Every day, she passed the Martin Luther King Jr. district on her way to school, feeling the echoes of that enduring fight for justice stir within her. Her parents often reminded her that she was a product of their sacrifices, and she wanted to carry that legacy forward. Through sheer determination and an uncanny intelligence, Aisha excelled in all her classes. She graduated at the top of her high school class at the age of 17, which paved the way for acceptance letters from prestigious universities all over the country. Many of her classmates envied her, but for Aisha, each acceptance letter was not just a personal triumph. It was a step forward for the entire Coleman family. And so, when she chose to attend Yale University, a name that carried enormous weight, she did so not just for herself but for the dreams of her parents and her entire community. She accepted a generous financial aid package and left Chicago for New Haven, Connecticut, brimming with hope and determination. Rising through the ranks. At Yale, Aisha felt for the first time the stark contrast between privilege and poverty, between those who had generational wealth and those who fought tooth and nail to rise above. She spent countless late nights in the library, devouring textbooks on political theory, civil rights, and constitutional law. Graduating summa cum laude, Aisha went on to earn a spot at Yale Law School, an achievement that once felt like a distant fantasy. But Aisha's ambition stretched beyond the walls of academia. She wanted hands-on experience in making the world a better place. During her summers, she interned at the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, advocating for prison reform and tackling unjust sentencing policies that disproportionately affected minority communities. She volunteered with local organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative, returning to her hometown to do pro bono work for those who couldn't afford an attorney. By her mid-20s, she had already caught the eye of high-profile legal firms in Washington, D.C. and New York. But Aisha turned them down. Instead, she made a surprising move. She decided to serve in the U.S. Army JAG Corps. She felt duty-bound to protect the constitutional rights of soldiers, many of whom came from the same marginalized communities she cared about. The rigor of basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri tested her in ways books at Yale couldn't prepare her for. Yet, she thrived, forging a steely resilience both physically and mentally. She steadily rose in rank, earning the respect of her peers and commanding officers alike. Eventually, Aisha's sharp mind, unwavering ethics, and relentless dedication earned her a coveted position in a specialized unit that handled top-secret legal matters. Her name appeared on case files stamped classified, and her colleagues in the Pentagon started to recognize her as a rising star. Her parents swelled with pride, and her mother often bragged about how her daughter was protecting the country from the inside. After fulfilling her service, Aisha could have walked into virtually any elite law firm in the country. Instead, she decided to return to Chicago, where she believed the fight for justice was still intense and personal. She hoped to open her own small practice focusing on civil rights cases and, perhaps, eventually run for a local judgeship. But fate had other plans for her. The encounter that changed everything. A single fateful encounter on a hot summer afternoon would catapult Aisha into the headlines. She had pulled into a small grocery store parking lot near the south side, her arms loaded with an assortment of legal files and groceries. The heat shimmered off the pavement as she balanced two grocery bags while rummaging in her purse for her car keys. That's when she noticed the piercing gaze of Officer Todd Mercer. He was sitting inside his patrol car, the engine running, air conditioning likely on full blast. His eyes were fixed on her in a way that set off alarm bells in Aisha's mind. She had seen that look before. Marshall stepped out of his patrol car and approached. His crisp uniform bore the Chicago Police Department badge, and his walk was marked by a swagger that suggested confidence or arrogance. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" he asked, leaning a bit too close, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. Aisha, knowing her rights, responded politely, "Yes, officer." "Is there a problem?" "Identification," he demanded. She let out a slow breath, carefully placing her groceries on the ground. As she handed over her license, she calmly asked, "Mind telling me why you're asking?" The tension thickened. "We've had some incidents of shoplifting around here, and you look suspicious." Aisha's eyebrows shot up. She was wearing a professional blouse and tailored pants, hardly the attire of a petty shoplifter. The store manager, an older woman named Diane, popped her head out. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked. "There's no need for you to worry," Mercer answered curtly, waving Diane away. He then looked back at Aisha's license. His lips tightened. "You sure you're not carrying any stolen items?" he asked, nodding toward the grocery bags. Aisha placed a hand on her hip. "Everything in that bag has a receipt," she replied, her voice firm. But that didn't stop Mercer from escalating the situation. Moments later, handcuffs were snapped around Aisha's wrists. The humiliation and anger burned through her as she realized what was happening. Officer Mercer had no idea who she really was, but he was about to find out. The unforgiving sun hung high over the Chicago side street as Aisha was led to the patrol car, her wrists bound in cold steel. A small crowd had started to gather, some pulling out their phones to record, others watching with quiet unease. "You're making a mistake," Aisha said through gritted teeth, her voice filled with controlled fury. Officer Mercer smirked, tightening the cuffs just enough to make her wince. "We'll see about that," he muttered as he pushed her into the back seat of the squad car. Inside, the stale air and lingering scent of sweat and disinfectant filled her nostrils. Aisha's heart pounded. She had spent years studying constitutional law, defending the rights of others. Now she was on the other side of the system, arrested on a baseless accusation. As the car pulled away, she caught a glimpse of the store manager, Diane, arguing with another officer. A sliver of hope flickered inside her. At least someone had witnessed what had happened. Maybe someone had filmed it. Her legal training kicked in. Stay calm. Don't resist. Use the system against them. But beneath her composed exterior, her blood boiled. The station was a gray, lifeless place. Just another institutional building where people like her were too often processed without a second thought. Aisha was led past rows of desks, a few officers giving her curious glances. She was placed in a holding cell, the metal bench cold against her skin. The cuffs had left red marks around her wrists, and she rubbed them absently, exhaling slowly. "This is temporary," she reminded herself. "They have nothing on me." Minutes crawled by. She had demanded a phone call, but Mercer had ignored her. Instead, he stood outside her cell, arms folded, staring at her like she was some sort of puzzle he couldn't figure out. "You want to tell me who you really are?" he sneered. "An attorney, huh? That's convenient." Aisha's pulse quickened. "Yes, I'm an attorney, and you have no grounds to keep me here. I demand to see a lawyer or to be released immediately." "Don't get ahead of yourself," he replied with a smirk. "We're checking if your license is valid. Could be fake for all I know." She clenched her fists. "Do you realize how insane that sounds?" Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Around here, we don't take any chances. And I don't like your attitude." Aisha stared at him, refusing to flinch. Just then, the heavy metal door swung open, and another officer walked in. A tall black woman with short cropped hair and an air of authority. Her badge read Lieutenant Angela Roberts. Miss Coleman? She asked, ignoring Mercer completely. That's right, Aisha replied, sensing the shift in power. Lieutenant Roberts shot Mercer a glare. You can leave now. He hesitated, then retreated, fuming. The lieutenant turned back to Aisha. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I need to hear your side of the story. Aisha took a deep breath and recounted everything. How Mercer had approached her without cause, how she had complied, and how he had arrested her anyway. Roberts nodded, her expression unreadable. We ran your license. You check out. Indeed, you're an attorney. But we also found something interesting on your record. U.S. Army JAG, correct? Aisha's eyebrows arched in surprise. She hadn't expected the station to have access to any references to her military background, especially her work in specialized units. But apparently, something had flagged her as more than just an ordinary attorney. Lieutenant Roberts sighed. Marshall claims you resisted arrest. We're still investigating whether that's justified. However, for now, you'll need to appear in court. Aisha's jaw clenched. On what charge? Resisting arrest, Roberts admitted, looking uncomfortable. The paperwork is being filed now. This is ridiculous, Aisha snapped. I understand, Roberts said, her voice softer now. But these things take time. Aisha exhaled sharply. She needed a lawyer, and she knew exactly who to call. The moment Aisha was allowed a phone call, she dialed the number of an old friend from Yale Law, Elena Thompson, a powerhouse attorney at a prominent civil rights firm in Chicago. The phone rang once, then twice. Aisha? What's wrong? Elena's voice was sharp with concern. I need representation, Aisha said flatly. Where are you? 27th Precinct. I'll be there in an hour, Elena promised. True to her word, Elena stormed into the station 45 minutes later, her heels clicking decisively on the linoleum floor. The moment she saw Aisha, her face darkened with fury. She wasted no time. Marching up to the desk sergeant, she demanded to see the supervising officer. Within minutes, Lieutenant Roberts appeared again. Miss Coleman is being released on her own recognizance, Roberts announced. Aisha exhaled in relief as the cuffs were removed. But she knew this wasn't over. The real battle was about to begin. Early morning light filtered through the courthouse windows as Aisha and Elena walked into Cook County Courthouse. The moment they entered, Aisha felt the weight of countless eyes on her. Word had spread quickly. The video of her arrest had gone viral. Clips of her calmly complying while Mercer escalated had been shared thousands of times online. Local activists had turned up in force. The courtroom was packed with supporters, reporters, and concerned citizens. Even her parents were there, her mother's eyes red with worry, her father's jaw set in anger. Across the room, Officer Mercer sat stiffly beside the city prosecutor, Christopher Hatch. Hatch looked calm, but Mercer looked anything but. His eyes darted around the room, as if sensing the tide turning against him. All rise, the bailiff called. Judge Diana Harkness, known for her strict but fair rulings, took her seat. Case number 2025-3198. State of Illinois versus Aisha Coleman. Charge: resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. Judge Harkness glanced at Aisha. Miss Coleman, how do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Aisha said firmly. Elena stood. Your Honor, we have witness statements and video evidence that directly contradict Officer Mercer's account. We'll be presenting them at the earliest opportunity. Judge Harkness tapped her pen against a stack of papers. Miss Coleman has no prior record, correct? Hatch flipped through his notes. None, Your Honor. The judge turned to Elena. What do you propose? Elena didn't hesitate. We request that all charges be dropped immediately. The evidence shows that Miss Coleman complied with every request and was arrested without probable cause. Judge Harkness sighed, weighing the matter. I'm not dismissing the charge yet, but I will set a hearing for the presentation of evidence. For now, Miss Coleman is released on her own recognizance. The gavel banged. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Cameras flashed. Reporters rushed forward. As Aisha stepped outside, she faced a wall of microphones. A reporter called out, Miss Coleman, are the rumors true? Did you serve in a classified military unit? Her breath caught. The real battle wasn't just about her arrest anymore. Now, her past was coming to light. Aisha Coleman stepped out of the courthouse into a storm of flashing cameras and eager reporters, their voices merging into a chaotic blur. The heat of the Chicago summer pressed against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the pressure of the moment. She kept her head high, her expression unreadable. She knew the next words out of her mouth could set the tone for the entire battle ahead. Elena stepped in quickly, placing a protective hand on Aisha's back as she faced the crowd. "Miss Coleman will not be making any statements at this time," she said firmly, steering Aisha toward the waiting car. But just as they reached the vehicle, a reporter's voice cut through the noise. "Miss Coleman, are the rumors true? Did you serve in a classified military unit?" Aisha stiffened. The question sent a jolt through her, though she had been expecting it. They had dug into her past faster than she anticipated. The issue at hand was no longer just her arrest. It was about who she was, what she had done, and whether her elite credentials would be used against her. She hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the car, the doors shutting behind her. Inside, she exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "They're going to use my military background against me," she muttered. Elena nodded, her face unreadable. "We need to be ready." The ride back to Elena's office was silent, but the tension between them spoke volumes. Aisha knew how these things worked. The moment the system felt threatened, it would fight back, twisting facts, manipulating narratives, turning the victim into the villain. And now that they had her army record, they would try to paint her as a dangerous figure, someone who had been trained to handle conflict in ways beyond the average citizen. The irony was unbearable. Her service, something she had dedicated years of her life to, was now ammunition against her. When they arrived at the firm, Elena wasted no time. She tossed her briefcase onto the desk, pulled up a chair, and motioned for Aisha to sit. "We have a problem," she said. "The prosecutor has subpoenaed your military records." Aisha clenched her fists. How much can they actually see? Elena sighed, flipping open a file. "Most of it is redacted, but they have enough. Your commendations, your JAG service, and a brief mention of an incident in Afghanistan. They're going to use it to suggest that you were more than capable of overpowering Mercer, that you resisted in a way that only someone with your training could." Aisha scoffed. "I didn't resist." "I know, but that's not the point," Elena said. "They're going to spin this however they can." Aisha leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. She thought about her time in the army, about the countless nights she had spent buried in legal documents, about the soldiers she had fought for in courtrooms that felt eerily similar to the one she had just walked out of. She had spent years defending others. Now she had to defend herself. "We need to control the narrative," Elena continued. "We can use your military background to our advantage. Show that you have a deep respect for the law, that your training only makes you more aware of what's right and wrong." Aisha nodded slowly. "And what about Mercer?" Elena's lips curled into a tight smile. "That's where things get interesting. We've been digging into his record, and it turns out you're not the first person he's targeted." A spark of hope flickered in Aisha's chest. "Go on." Elena pulled out a separate file. Multiple complaints of excessive force, targeting black men and women disproportionately. Most of the complaints were buried, but we found a few victims who were willing to testify. Aisha's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of both fury and resolve through her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person Mercer had harassed, every life he had disrupted with his unchecked power. "We're going to fight back," Elena said. "Not just for you. For everyone." Aisha exhaled, the weight of the situation settling over her. She had always known that the road to justice was never easy, but she hadn't expected to be thrust into the center of it so suddenly. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. Over the next few days, the media frenzy around her case only intensified. News outlets ran stories about her past, highlighting her education, her military service, and the fact that she had turned down high-profile legal careers to return to Chicago. Some called her a hero. Others questioned her motives. Conservative commentators painted her as a radical, someone who had used her training to intimidate a police officer. The narrative was shifting, and Aisha knew she had to get ahead of it. At Elena's suggestion, she agreed to do an exclusive interview with a local news station. Sitting across from the anchor in a sleek television studio, she spoke calmly but firmly. "I complied with every request Officer Mercer made," she said. "I gave him my license. I let him check my bags. And yet, he still arrested me. Why? Because he saw me as a threat. Not because of anything I did, but because of who I am." The anchor leaned forward. "Some have pointed to your military background as a factor, that you were highly trained and could have resisted in ways the public might not see." Aisha didn't flinch. "Let me be clear. I did not resist. My military training taught me discipline, restraint, and respect for the law. If anything, it made me more aware of my rights and my responsibilities. What happened to me wasn't about my training. It was about racial profiling." The interview went viral within hours. Her words resonated with thousands, and the pressure on the city to investigate Mercer only grew. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Internal Affairs had begun its own probe into his actions. Then, a breakthrough. Elena's team uncovered damning evidence. Mercer had falsified police reports before. In one case, he had altered details to justify an unlawful stop. In another, he had forged a witness statement. The pieces were falling into place. The day of Aisha's evidentiary hearing, the courtroom was packed once again. The judge, after reviewing the video evidence, the witness testimonies, and Mercer's questionable record, made a decision that sent ripples through the entire city. "The charges against Miss Coleman are dismissed," she declared. "Furthermore, given the evidence presented, I am recommending a full review of Officer Mercer's conduct." The courtroom erupted in a mix of applause and stunned murmurs. Aisha felt the tension leave her body as Elena squeezed her shoulder in triumph. She was free, but as she stepped outside, facing the swarm of reporters once again, she knew this fight was far from over. Mercer might have been exposed, but the system that allowed him to operate unchecked was still intact. Over the next few weeks, as Internal Affairs completed its investigation, the truth about Mercer unraveled further. When the department announced his termination, it felt like a small victory. But it wasn't enough. That's when the call came. "Miss Coleman," the voice on the other end said, "this is John Keene from the U.S. Department of Justice. We'd like to discuss the possibility of your involvement in a new task force on police reform." Aisha stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had left public service once before, thinking her work was done. Now, she realized it was only just beginning. She took a deep breath. "I'm listening." Aisha Coleman sat in the conference room of the Chicago Civil Rights Center, staring at the papers spread out before her. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the room. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind. Her case had been dismissed, Mercer had been fired, and now the Department of Justice wanted her on a national police reform task force. Elena sat across from her, sipping a cup of coffee, watching her with an unreadable expression. "So," she said finally, "are you going to take the DOJ's offer?" Aisha exhaled, tapping her pen against the table. "I don't know. Part of me feels like I should. But another part of me," she trailed off, struggling to put her thoughts into words, "wants to stay here," Elena finished for her. Aisha nodded. "The fight isn't just in Washington. It's here, in Chicago, in cities across the country." Elena set down her cup. "You could do both, you know. Take the position, but still work here. Use your platform to push for real change." Aisha considered that. Before her arrest, she had imagined a quiet life, a small law practice, civil rights cases here and there. Now, she was at the center of something much bigger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every black man and woman who had been stopped, harassed, or falsely accused. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Elena called. One of their interns, Jordan, stepped inside. His face lit up with excitement. "You guys need to see this." He handed Aisha a tablet. On the screen was a breaking news alert. The headline made her breath catch. "Former Officer Todd Mercer indicted on federal civil rights charges." Aisha's eyes widened. "Federal charges?" Jordan nodded. "Yep. Turns out, falsifying police reports wasn't his only offense. The DOJ found evidence that he fabricated evidence in past cases. They're going after him hard. Elena let out a low whistle. Looks like the system is finally working for once. Aisha wasn't so sure. One bad cop being held accountable was a start, but it wasn't the end goal. The system didn't just need punishment, it needed reform. That afternoon, as she walked through downtown Chicago, she saw the impact of her case everywhere. People nodded at her in the street. Some stopped to shake her hand, thanking her for standing up. Others shared their own stories of racial profiling, wrongful arrests, and fear of the very people sworn to protect them. By the time she returned to her office, her decision was made. She picked up her phone and dialed the number from the DOJ. "This is Aisha Coleman," she said when John Keene answered. "I'd like to be part of the task force." Keene's voice was warm with approval. "That's great to hear, Miss Coleman. Welcome aboard." She hung up and let the moment sink in. She had walked into a courtroom as a defendant. Now, she was walking into the halls of power as a force for change. The first official meeting for the newly formed Task Force on Law Enforcement Accountability and Community Trust took place in a sleek, modern federal building in downtown Washington, D.C. Aisha sat at a long mahogany table, surrounded by some of the most powerful voices in criminal justice reform: civil rights attorneys, community activists, law enforcement officials, and federal prosecutors. Judge Margaret Liu, a respected federal judge and the task force's chairwoman, opened the meeting. "We've been brought together at a pivotal moment in our nation's history," she said. "We have an opportunity to implement real, lasting reform. Let's not waste it." Aisha listened as others shared their ideas: stricter oversight on police misconduct, national de-escalation training, independent review boards. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't hesitate. "I've lived this," she said. "I've felt the cold steel of handcuffs on my wrists. I've been profiled. I've been humiliated. But I also know the law. And I know that unless we change the system itself, we'll keep seeing the same stories play out over and over again." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The conversation continued for hours, each voice adding new layers to the fight ahead. Aisha was assigned to the Policy and Training Subcommittee, where she would help draft recommendations for federal law enforcement reforms. By the time the meeting ended, she felt something she hadn't in weeks: hope. That night, she called her parents from her hotel room. "We saw the news," her mother said. "Your father and I are so proud of you." Aisha smiled. "It's just the beginning, Mom." Her father's voice came through the speaker. "You remember what I always told you?" She closed her eyes. Justice isn't given. It's fought for. And she was ready for the fight. Back in Chicago, the Civil Rights Center was busier than ever. Calls poured in from people who had been harassed, falsely arrested, or mistreated by the police. One case stood out. A young man named Marcus Evans had been arrested by Mercer a year earlier. His case had been dismissed, but the arrest had cost him a scholarship. With Mercer now exposed, Marcus wanted to sue the city for damages. Aisha agreed to take the case. During the deposition, Marcus's voice trembled with emotion as he recounted the night Mercer had pulled him over for a broken taillight that wasn't actually broken. He had been yanked from his car, handcuffed, and held overnight without cause. Aisha felt a familiar rage rising inside her. This was why she was here. This was why the fight mattered. The city settled Marcus's case quickly, but Aisha knew there were countless others like him. And she wasn't going to stop until every one of them got the justice they deserved. Months later, Aisha sat in a packed courtroom as Todd Mercer faced trial. The former officer sat stiffly at the defense table, his face pale as prosecutors outlined his pattern of abuse. The evidence was overwhelming: falsified reports, racial profiling, excessive force. Aisha watched as his former partner, Officer Jeremy Tolliver, took the stand and testified against him. "I knew what he was doing was wrong," Tolliver admitted, "but I was afraid to speak up. I'm not afraid anymore." It was the final nail in Mercer's coffin. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with a verdict: guilty. Aisha let out a slow breath. Justice had been served. But she knew that true justice wasn't about one bad cop going to prison. It was about fixing the system that let him thrive for so long. Months passed, and Aisha found herself back in Washington, preparing to testify before Congress. The task force's recommendations had been finalized, and now lawmakers were debating a new bill aimed at ending racial profiling and increasing police accountability. As she sat before the House Judiciary Committee, cameras flashing, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. She took a deep breath and began. My name is Aisha Coleman. I am a civil rights attorney, a veteran, and a survivor of police misconduct. I am here because I believe in justice, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been targeted unfairly. The law should protect us all, and it's time we make sure it does. As she spoke, she saw the faces in the room shift, some nodding in agreement, others furrowing their brows in resistance. But she didn't care. She had once been just another name on a case file. Now, she was a voice for change, and she wasn't backing down. The congressional hearing room was packed, cameras rolling as Aisha Coleman sat at the witness table, facing a panel of lawmakers. Some looked at her with respect, others with skepticism, but she had been in more intimidating rooms before. She squared her shoulders, took a breath, and continued. This isn't about a single officer, she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. This is about a system that protects bad cops, that allows racial profiling to go unchecked, that makes people like me, law-abiding, professional, and trained in the law, feel like criminals simply because of the color of our skin. That has to change. Senator Robert Callahan, a conservative from Texas, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. Miss Coleman, some argue that these reforms could make it harder for law enforcement to do their jobs, that officers might hesitate in dangerous situations. What do you say to that? Aisha met his gaze without flinching. Senator, accountability and public safety are not opposites. In fact, they go hand in hand. When officers are held to the highest standards, the trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve improves. When trust improves, cooperation increases. And that makes their jobs easier, not harder. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Even some of the skeptical lawmakers seemed to be considering her words. Representative Lisa Moreno, a progressive from California, nodded approvingly. Miss Coleman, you were arrested without cause, profiled despite your impeccable record. And yet, instead of walking away from this system, you're working to change it. What? Aisha's expression softened slightly. Because I believe in justice, she said simply. Not just in theory, but in practice. And if we don't fight for a better system, who will? The committee members exchanged glances. The hearing continued for hours, with Aisha and other experts providing testimony on the urgent need for police accountability. By the time she stepped out of the Capitol building, the sky was turning a warm shade of orange. Elena was waiting for her outside, arms crossed, a small smirk on her face. You just made some powerful enemies, Elena teased. Aisha chuckled. And maybe a few allies. Elena handed her a phone. Take a look. Aisha glanced at the screen. Social media was exploding with support. The hashtag #JusticeForAll was trending, and clips from her testimony were being shared by activists, journalists, and even a few lawmakers. They're listening, Elena said. For now, Aisha replied. The real test is whether they act. Over the next few months, Aisha juggled two lives. Her role on the Police Reform Task Force in Washington and her work at the Chicago Civil Rights Center. In Chicago, she continued representing victims of police misconduct. Cases poured in. Men and women who had suffered at the hands of officers like Mercer, people who had been silenced or ignored for too long. One case in particular stood out. A teenage boy named Jamal Rivers had been wrongfully arrested and beaten in custody. His mother, Angela, had seen Aisha's testimony and reached out, desperate for help. They broke his ribs, Angela said, her voice trembling. They said he resisted, but he's just a kid. He didn't do anything. Aisha took the case without hesitation. The lawsuit against the Chicago Police Department gained momentum quickly, drawing even more national attention. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, chanting Jamal's name. The department, under growing scrutiny, settled for a record amount. But Aisha knew money wasn't enough. She wanted policy changes. And she wasn't the only one. Across the country, people were waking up. Police departments in major cities started reviewing their policies. Local governments passed de-escalation training requirements. Civilian oversight boards gained more power. Change was slow, but it was happening. As for Todd Mercer, his fall from grace was swift and brutal. After his conviction, More victims came forward. Lawsuits stacked up against the city, each one revealing more of his corrupt history. The final blow came when his former colleagues turned on him, admitting that he had falsified evidence for years. One night, as Aisha was working late in her office, she received a text from Elena. "It's over. Mercer just took a plea deal. He's going to federal prison." Aisha sat back in her chair, staring at the message. She should have felt victorious, but all she felt was resolve. This wasn't about one bad cop going to prison. It was about ensuring that men like him never had the power to destroy innocent lives again. 1 year after her arrest, Aisha stood at a podium in front of a massive crowd in Grant Park, Chicago. The air buzzed with energy. Thousands had gathered: activists, community leaders, families of victims, everyday people who believed in the movement she had helped ignite. Elena stood beside her, grinning. "Ready for this?" Aisha nodded. She stepped forward, gripping the microphone, letting her eyes sweep over the sea of faces. "A year ago, I was standing in a parking lot, minding my own business, when a man with a badge decided that my existence was a threat," she began. The crowd murmured in agreement. "I could have given up. I could have walked away. But I refused. Because this fight isn't just about me. It's about all of us." Applause thundered through the park. "This is just the beginning," she continued. "We will not stop until our voices are heard. Until our communities are protected, not targeted. Until justice is not just an idea, but a guarantee." The crowd erupted. As Aisha stepped back, she felt something shift inside her. For months, people had been asking her what was next. Would she stay in civil rights law? Would she run for office? Would she take on an even bigger role in the movement? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Months later, Aisha sat in her office, sorting through a stack of legal briefs, when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was Washington, D.C. She hesitated, then answered. "Miss Coleman." The voice was warm but formal. "This is Senator Lisa Moreno. I wanted to speak with you about an opportunity." Aisha's brow furrowed. "What kind of opportunity?" A pause. Then, "Have you ever considered running for office?" Aisha's heart skipped a beat. She thought about her journey. The arrest, the courtroom battles, the task force, the marches, the policies she had helped shape. She had never planned to enter politics. But maybe it was time. She took a slow breath and smiled. "I'm listening."